More recently, during the election, all this enthusiasm for Bernie Sanders was taking place while people in Venezuela, under a socialist government, with lots of oil,
a rich country, a rich in natural resources country.
Rich in natural resources country, was starving. They were breaking into grocery stores to get desperate to get food. They're going into other countries to try to find something to eat. And the two things never came together. And they saw socialism as an idea. Socialism has always been a wonderful sounding idea. It's only when you put it into practice that you discover that there are real problems.
The most spectacularly successful political doctrine in the 20th century was Marxism, based on the implicit presumption that differences in wealth were due to capitalists growing rich by keeping the workers poor through exploitation. Now, what was wrong with that assumption?
Well, it sounded good like so many others, but again,
and you speak as a former Marxist. You were a Marxist.
Oh, yes.
You considered yourself a Marxist for some years.
Oh, during the McCarthy era, by the way.
Tom always swimming against the stream.
It simply was never put to any test. Now, the test I suggest is a simple one, but it is a test. And if it's true that the rich are rich because they're keeping the poor poor, then in a country with lots of billionaires, you should correspondingly have great amounts of poor people. But if you compare the actual data, there are more billionaires in the United States than in Africa and the Middle East put together. And yet the standard of living of the poor in the United States is higher than that of people in Africa and the Middle East. So by that simple standard, it just doesn't hold up.
There are problems with the theory. A recent YouGov survey, the proportion of baby boomers, that's my group, who hold favorable views of communism is just 4%. The proportion of millennials, that's my kids and your grandkids, who hold favorable views of communism is 19%.
Yes.
Roughly 1 in 5 young Americans now holds a favorable view of communism. What do you do with that datum?
Well, I think I get very pessimistic. More recently, during the election, all this enthusiasm for Bernie Sanders was taking place while people in Venezuela, under a socialist government, with lots of oil.
A rich country, a rich in natural resources country.
Rich in natural resources country, was starving. They were breaking into grocery stores to get desperate to get food. They're going into other countries to try to find something to eat. And the two things never came together. And they saw socialism as an idea. Socialism has always been a wonderful sounding idea. It's only when you put it into practice that you discover that there are real problems.
All right. It is far easier to concentrate, again, I'm quoting from Intellectuals in Society, it is far easier to concentrate power than to concentrate knowledge.
Yes.
What bearing has that got on the influence that intellectuals have over society as a whole?
Because they believe that since knowledge is concentrated in people like themselves, what needs to be done is, in a quote from President Obama, is to put more power in the hands of the experts.
So the intellectual temptation is to say, look, we already know everything.
That's right.
If only we also had
the power,
all the power,
yes,
everything would be just fine.
Yes.
And what's wrong with that view? Why isn't that a sensible view?
One, they don't know everything. They don't know 1/10 of everything. In fact, I argue that they probably don't know 1% of the consequential knowledge in a society.
Consequential knowledge is a concept that runs through this book. Explain that concept.
Knowledge whose presence or absence has consequences, serious consequences. I mean, I was once in a plane that was coming down for a landing in the Ithaca airport, and suddenly the pilot gunned the motor and went up again because someone in the control tower had reminded him that he hadn't lowered his landing gear. So that was consequential knowledge,
right?
Yes. I was just delighted that person had his eyes open and his mind on his work.
So the notion here is that the kind of knowledge, the kind of consequential knowledge required to prove effective in governing a nation such as the United States with the biggest economy in the world, 300 million people, you can put together quite a large group of professors, and they're still not going to possess the knowledge that would enable them to run General Motors, for example, or to run the nation's healthcare system, for example.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that has happened all around the world in the 20th century was that all sorts of countries have tried central planning. Now, the guys who run the central planning, they usually have advanced degrees from prestigious institutions. They have mountains of statistics sitting there, and they have all the experts in the country at their beck and call. And yet, when you take the power out of their hands and return it to the market, then all the hundreds of millions of people who don't have any of those things usually end up with a higher rate of growth and a more rapid decline in poverty.
Because consequential knowledge by its nature tends to be diffused, widely diffused.
Yes, yes. Right. This philosophy begins with a seductive premise that socialism is morally superior, that it cares more about the poor, that it gives power to the people, but what it really gives is power to politicians. Bernie Sanders once said, I think we should look to countries like Denmark, like Sweden and Norway and learn what they have accomplished for their working people. But what he fails to mention, whether through ignorance or ideology, is that these countries are not socialist. They are capitalist countries with large welfare states. They built their wealth through free markets. Their redistribution came later. And even then, they've spent the last 2 decades rolling it back. As I wrote in The Vision of the Anointed, much of the social vision of intellectuals is both unrealistic and untested. Reality is often shrugged off as somehow being less important than the vision. Socialism appeals to that vision, the utopia that exists only in the minds of elites who do not bear the consequences of being wrong. Socialism's defenders on the American left speak of free healthcare, free college, and economic justice, as if repeating the word free enough times will make scarcity vanish. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for instance, has championed the Green New Deal, a document promising universal employment, guaranteed income, and nationalized energy infrastructure, all without a single coherent cost estimate. But economics is not about what sounds good, it's about trade-offs. There is no such thing as free health care. You either pay for it through higher taxes or degraded services. In basic economics, I said the first lesson of economics is scarcity. There's never enough of anything to fully satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. And that's exactly what politicians like Sanders and AOC do. They offer what cannot be delivered without consequences they never discuss. Socialism thrives on envy. It is not built on lifting up the poor, but on tearing down the successful. Sanders doesn't just argue that the rich should pay more. He implies they got rich by harming others. He once declared that billionaires should not exist, as if wealth creation were a zero-sum game. This worldview is toxic. In the quest for cosmic justice, I warned that envy was once considered one of the 7 deadly sins before it became one of the most admired virtues under its new name, social justice. The politics of resentment fuels socialism, not because the system works, but because it targets the system that does. One of the most dangerous aspects of this socialist resurgence is the sheer historical ignorance of its advocates. They speak glowingly of socialism as though it were a new experiment. But socialism is not new. It has been tried repeatedly and failed catastrophically. The Soviet Union, Mao's China, Cuba, Venezuela. These are not anomalies. They are the predictable outcomes of a system where power is centralized and incentives are distorted. Venezuela, once the richest country in Latin America, was transformed into a failed state by the very policies Sanders and AOC endorse. Massive nationalizations, price controls, wage controls, all led to hyperinflation, food shortages, and mass poverty. And yet, as I noted in Intellectuals in Society, the fatal attraction of government power for intellectuals is not just the prospect of being able to shape policy, but the feeling of moral superiority it gives them. That moral superiority blinds them to the lessons of history. Another reason Democrats gravitate toward socialism is the belief in central planning, the notion that bureaucrats in Washington can allocate resources more efficiently than the decentralized decisions of millions of people in a market. But history shows otherwise. Every planned economy has produced a misallocation, inefficiency, and ultimately stagnation. In contrast, the free market, imperfect as it may be, responds to supply, demand, prices, and competition. It is self-correcting, adaptable, and driven by information. As I stated in Knowledge and Decisions, the most basic question is not what is best, but who shall decide what is best. The socialist answer is always the same, the state. And that answer should terrify us. Socialism appeals to the young because they have no memory of its failures. College campuses are ground zero for the spread of these ideas, often taught by professors who have never worked in the real economy and who view profit as exploitation rather than productivity. Why? Because socialism cloaks itself in compassion, but compassion with other people's money is not morality. It is the easiest virtue to signal and the hardest one to measure. Now, in A Conflict of Visions, I explained that the unconstrained vision embodied by socialists assumes that human nature is essentially good and perfectible, and that systemic problems require systemic overhauls led by enlightened elites. But this is fantasy. Human nature is not perfectible, and systems designed on that premise collapse under the weight of reality. Socialist rhetoric, like that of Sanders and AOC, divides the country into villains and victims, the 1% and the 99%. But this narrative is dangerously simplistic. The top 1% is not a static group of robber barons. People move in and out of income brackets throughout their lives. A small business owner who takes risks and succeeds is not the same as a rent-seeking crony capitalist. But the rhetoric makes no distinction. Why? Because class warfare works. It galvanizes support, distracts from failure, and justifies government expansion. But here's the truth. In every socialist economy, the very class warfare meant to empower the poor ends up concentrating power in the hands of the political elite. The poor get poorer, and the planners get richer. As I wrote in The Vision of the Anointed do not merely believe they know what is best. They believe they must be given the power to impose it. And socialism is their tool. Now ask yourself, are Sanders and AOC truly trying to solve poverty, or are they trying to seize and centralize power in the name of solving poverty? Real solutions to poverty, economic growth, education reform, job creation, deregulation, these don't require revolution. They require freedom. But socialism is not about solving problems. It is about shifting power from individuals to the state. And once the state has that power, it never gives it back. Socialism is not a future vision. It is a recurring nightmare. It has failed every time it has been tried, not because of poor implementation, but because its core assumptions about human nature, incentives, and economics are wrong. As I've often said, much of the social history of the Western world over the past 3 decades has involved replacing what worked with what sounded good. Democrats like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are not new thinkers. They are the latest in a long line of ideologues who trade in promises and reap in power. And unless Americans learn the real history, not the sanitized slogans, we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. Socialism is not compassion. It is coercion. It is not justice. It is jealousy. It is not progress. It is regression. And the facts, history, and logic are clear if only we are willing to look.